Let me tell you something that should stop you cold. 4 days ago, the President of the United States stood in front of the entire country and told the American people that his preference was diplomacy. 4 days, that is all it took. Because this morning, American and Israeli jets are over Iran. Missiles are in the air, smoke is rising over Tehran, and the man who said he preferred peace just posted an 8-minute video on social media confirming he launched what he is calling a massive and ongoing military operation against the Islamic Republic of Iran, 4 days between the word diplomacy and the sound of bombs. Let that land for a second, because what just happened is not just a military story. It is not just a Middle East story. It is a story about what this president's words actually mean. And the answer to that question affects every single country on this planet that has been trying to figure out how to deal with Donald Trump, including the one right next door. Let me show you what's really happening. While the world wakes up to breaking news alerts and anchors scramble to their desks, while social media floods with videos of explosions over Tehran and air raid sirens blaring across Israel, the mainstream media is already covering the wrong story. They are covering the what, the strikes, the smoke, the missiles, the military hardware. But they are completely missing the why, not the official why, not the talking points about nuclear programs and ballistic missiles. The real why, the why that explains how we got from a State of the Union speech about affordability and diplomacy on Tuesday night to a war with Iran on Saturday morning. That gap, those 4 days, that is the story nobody is telling you right now. And once you understand it, you will never look at anything this president says the same way again. Here's what you need to understand. On February 24th, 2026, Donald Trump walked into the House chamber for the State of the Union address, the most watched political speech of the year. And on the subject of Iran, he said something very specific. He said, quote, "My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy." He said it clearly. He said it publicly. He said it to the American people and to every government in the world that was watching. My preference is diplomacy. 4 days later, he launched a war. And here is the thing that makes this truly extraordinary. When Trump said those words on Tuesday night, he already had 2 aircraft carriers in the Middle East. He already had dozens of F-35s, F-16s, and F-22s repositioned within strike range of Iran. He already had the target packages developed. He already had the operational plans finalized. The military operation that launched this morning was not improvised in response to a diplomatic breakdown. It was planned, prepared, and ready to execute while Trump was standing at that podium telling the world he preferred talking. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because this story does not start on Tuesday. It starts months ago, and the timeline is extraordinary once you see it laid out. In January 2026, Iran's government cracked down violently on anti-government protesters. Thousands were killed. Trump threatened to intervene on behalf of the protesters, saying he would attack Iran with speed and violence if leaders did not comply with American demands. But Gulf allies and Israel both said, hold on. They were worried about a wider regional conflict spinning out of control. They asked Trump to give diplomacy a chance, and Trump listened. He sent Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner to Oman, and then to Geneva, for multiple rounds of indirect negotiations with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The talks went on through February. As recently as this week, Araghchi said the 2 sides had agreed on a set of principles to frame future discussions. That sounds like progress. That sounds like movement. That sounds like 2 sides genuinely trying to find a deal. But here is what was happening simultaneously. While diplomats were talking in Geneva, the Pentagon was executing the largest American military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. 2 aircraft carriers, aerial refueling aircraft, surveillance planes, dozens of the most advanced fighter jets in the American arsenal, all of it quietly moving into position, all of it within strike range of Iran. You do not assemble that kind of military force just in case diplomacy fails. That takes months of planning. Logistics chains, supply lines, coordination with allied air forces, pre-positioned munitions, target packages developed and refined over weeks. The military operation that launched this morning was being built at the exact same time. The diplomatic track was running. They were parallel processes, and only one of them was ever meant to succeed. And here is the kicker. Trump was demanding something Iran could never agree to. He wanted 2 things above all others. First, Iran had to permanently and completely stop enriching uranium, not pause it, not reduce it, stop it forever. Second, Iran had to dismantle its entire ballistic missile program. Iran's response was equally clear. They would not surrender their missiles under any circumstances. And while they denied any intention to build a nuclear weapon, they insisted on their sovereign right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. That is not a negotiating gap. That is an unbridgeable chasm. And both sides knew it going in. So you have to ask yourself the question that nobody in mainstream media is asking right now. Did the Trump administration genuinely believe Iran would accept those terms? Or did they set those terms precisely because they knew Iran would reject them, giving Trump the justification he needed to do what he was always planning to do? Because here's what we know for certain. The military was ready before the diplomacy failed. The planes were in position before the talks collapsed. And Trump told the world he preferred diplomacy 4 days before he launched the bombs. That is not a diplomatic failure. That is a performance. And the audience was not Iran. The audience was the American people and America's allies who needed to see Trump try before he struck. But wait, it gets worse. Because 4 days ago at the State of the Union, Trump did something else that now looks completely different in hindsight. He barely talked about foreign policy. His advisors had told him that foreign policy aggression was hurting him domestically, that voters were connecting his international posturing to economic uncertainty and rising prices. So he gave a domestic speech: affordability, no tax on tips, Trump accounts for babies, retirement matching for workers. He looked like a president focused on the American family, not a commander-in-chief about to launch a military strike against a nation of 90 million people. The domestic pivot was the cover. The warmth and the kitchen table economics were the distraction. And 96 hours later, the bombs fell. Now let's talk about what this means for the rest of the world, because this is where the story gets genuinely frightening. Mark Carney has spent the last 6 months building an entire foreign policy strategy around a single assumption: that Trump bluffs, that Trump escalates rhetorically but retreats when the costs become real. Carney said it publicly. He called Trump's threats bluster. His entire negotiating posture on trade, on USMCA, on Canadian sovereignty was built on the belief that Trump always chickens out. And on trade, he has been right every single time. Every tariff threat, every ultimatum, Trump backed down. The strategy worked. But Iran is not a trade dispute, and Trump did not chicken out. He launched the strikes. And that single fact changes the calculation for every country that has been watching this play out. If Trump is willing to go to war with a country of 90 million people 4 days after saying he preferred diplomacy, what does that mean for the USMCA review in July? What does it mean for every European leader who concluded that Trump is all threat and no follow-through? What does it mean for China, for Japan, for Saudi Arabia, for every middle power that has been quietly recalibrating its relationship with the United States based on the assumption that Trump's red lines are negotiable? It means that assumption just got significantly more complicated. And the world is processing that in real time right now. Let me give you the receipts, because the numbers here are staggering and they matter to your daily life in ways that are already showing up. Receipt 1, oil. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point for global energy supply. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it every single day. Iran has the ability to threaten or attempt to close that strait in retaliation for tonight's strikes. Oil futures spiked the moment news broke. Markets across Asia opened sharply lower. If Iran moves against the strait, even partially, oil prices do not just rise, they surge. And when oil prices surge, you feel it within 2 weeks at the gas pump at the grocery store, in the price of everything that moves on a truck. The inflation that Trump has been desperately trying to talk down at kitchen table speeches across America comes roaring back faster than any tariff ever could. Receipt 2. American troops. The United States has military personnel stationed across the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in the Gulf states, in Jordan. Thousands of American men and women in uniform within range of Iranian retaliation. Iran has promised for months that any strikes would be met with response. Within hours of the U.S. and Israeli strikes, the IDF reported missiles already launched from Iran toward Israel. The question is not whether Iran retaliates. It already has. The question is how far that retaliation goes, and whether American soldiers are in the crosshairs when it does. Receipt 3, Iran's proxies. This is the part that should scare everyone paying attention, Iran does not just fight with its own military. It has spent decades building a network of proxy forces across the entire region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with precision missiles that can reach deep into Israeli territory. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, who have already demonstrated the ability to threaten commercial shipping across the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, and Syria positioned within striking distance of American bases. Any or all of these could activate in the coming hours. And if they do, the conflict does not stay between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. It spreads. And a spreading Middle East conflict is the scenario that the global economy is least equipped to handle right now. Receipt 4, the nuclear question. Trump justified these strikes in part by accusing Iran of rebuilding its nuclear program. Iran denied it. But here is the uncomfortable reality that no one in the White House seems to have fully grappled with. Destroying a nation's entire nuclear capability in a single night of airstrikes has never been achieved in the history of modern warfare. Iran has spent decades building redundant, hardened, deeply buried nuclear facilities specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of attack. Some of those facilities are buried so deep that even the most powerful conventional munitions struggle to reach them. If tonight's strikes damaged Iran's nuclear program but did not destroy it, Trump will have launched a war, unified Iranian public opinion against the United States, activated proxy forces across the region, and spiked global oil prices, without achieving the objective he used to justify all of it. And a damaged but surviving Iranian nuclear program, led by a regime that just got bombed by America, is far more likely to accelerate toward a weapon than a program that was never attacked. Trump may have just made the nuclear threat worse, not better. Now let's talk about the political dimension, because the timing of this is extraordinary and it cannot be a coincidence. Just weeks ago, Trump's team was telling reporters that the president needed to pivot to domestic issues ahead of the midterms, that foreign policy aggression was hurting him in the polls, that voters were tired of uncertainty and wanted to see a focus on affordability. The State of the Union was supposed to be that pivot, and it was for 4 days. Now there is a war, and wars do something very specific to American politics in the short term. They rally opinion around the commander-in-chief. The cable news coverage shifts from tariffs and inflation to military maps and strike footage. The conversation changes. Republicans who were quietly worried about midterm polling suddenly have a reason to rally behind the president. For a few weeks at least, the political news cycle belongs entirely to Trump. But here is the thing about military rallies in the polls. They are temporary, and they come with a bill. If this operation achieves its objectives quickly and cleanly, if Iran's missile program is genuinely degraded, if the retaliation is contained, if no American soldiers die, Trump emerges stronger. His approval goes up. The midterm picture improves. The gamble pays off. But if American casualties mount, if the retaliation spreads, if oil prices spike and inflation returns, if the operation drags on without a clear victory, if it turns out Iran's nuclear program survived the strikes relatively intact, then the rally effect evaporates and Trump is left with a war, rising prices, and a midterm election 6 months away. History is not kind to presidents who launch military operations that do not produce quick, clean results. Ask Lyndon Johnson, ask George W. Bush. And here's the detail that should make every Republican senator nervous right now. 25 Republican senators broke with Trump on Canada tariffs just weeks ago. They did it because their constituents were feeling economic pain and they chose their voters over their president. If this war produces economic pain, if gas prices spike in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, those same senators face the same calculation again. Except this time the stakes are higher, because you cannot vote to limit a war the way you can vote to limit a tariff. Let me tell you about the man on the other side of this, because Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing for exactly this outcome for years. Netanyahu has an International Criminal Court arrest warrant hanging over his head for alleged war crimes in Gaza. He has been conducting a military campaign there for over 2 years. He has been urging the United States to demand Iran curb its ballistic missile program and halt funding for proxy groups. He pushed for strikes that would target not just Iranian centrifuges, but Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command and control nodes. Netanyahu hailed the strikes this morning, saying, quote, "A short time ago, Israel and the United States embarked on an operation to remove the existential threat posed by the terrorist regime in Iran. Netanyahu got what he wanted. The question now is whether what Netanyahu wanted and what is good for the United States are actually the same thing. And that is a question worth sitting with. Now let's talk about China and Russia, because they are watching this very carefully, and their response in the next 24 hours will tell you a great deal about how the next chapter of this story unfolds. China has significant economic investments in Iran. It has been quietly positioning itself as an alternative security guarantor for countries that feel threatened by American unpredictability. If China publicly condemns the strikes and moves to deepen its relationship with Iran in response, it accelerates the global realignment that has been building for months. Every country watching tonight is updating its threat assessment of the United States, not its assessment of America as an adversary, its assessment of America as a partner, as a reliable, predictable, trustworthy partner. And China will be ready to offer an alternative to every country that decides American partnership is too unpredictable to depend on. Russia has its own calculations. Iran and Russia have been quietly cooperating on military technology for years. A U.S. strike on Iran is a challenge to that relationship that Russia cannot simply ignore without looking weak. Watch what Moscow says in the next 12 hours. Watch whether it is condemnation or quiet escalation. Here's what you need to watch in the hours and days ahead. First, watch the scale of Iranian retaliation. Missiles are already in the air toward Israel, but that is the opening move. Watch whether Hezbollah activates from Lebanon. Watch whether the Houthis resume attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. And most critically, watch whether any American military personnel are killed in retaliatory strikes on U.S. bases in the region. American casualties change everything. They make de-escalation politically impossible and further escalation almost inevitable. Second, watch oil prices the moment markets fully open. The initial futures spike is just the beginning. Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan will be issuing emergency notes to clients within hours. Watch what those notes say. They will tell you what the smart money thinks about how long this lasts and how far it goes. If you have a 401k, if you pay for gas, if you heat your home, what happens in those oil markets in the next 48 hours matters to your wallet directly and personally. Third, watch America's Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. These countries host American military bases and depend on American security guarantees. But they also have relationships with Iran they have carefully maintained. They asked Trump not to strike in January. He agreed then. He did not agree now. Watch how they respond publicly. Watch whether they quietly open back channels to Tehran. Their reaction will tell you whether this conflict stays contained or spreads across the entire Gulf region. Fourth, watch the Republican Party. Specifically, watch the senators who broke with Trump on Canada. A military rally effect will bring most of them back in line in the short term. But if the economic consequences of this war start hitting their constituents before November, watch whether the coalition that defied Trump on tariffs finds its voice again on something far more consequential. Fifth, and pay very close attention to this one. Watch what Mark Carney says, because Carney built his entire strategy around the assumption that Trump chickens out. Tonight, Trump did not chicken out. Carney is going to have to recalibrate. And how he recalibrates what he says publicly in the next 48 hours will tell you whether the global coalition of middle powers he has been quietly assembling sees this as a reason to accelerate their independence from American leadership or a reason to pull back and reconsider. The real story tonight is not the explosions over Tehran. It is not the missile trajectories or the carrier groups or the strike packages. The real story is what this moment reveals about the world we are now living in. A world where the President of the United States says diplomacy is his preference on Tuesday and launches a war on Saturday. A world where military buildups happen in parallel with diplomatic talks, and the talks are as much theater as process. A world where the gap between what America says and what America does has become so wide that every ally, every adversary, every neutral nation has to plan for both simultaneously. Trump wanted to project strength tonight. He has done that. The strikes are real. The military capability is real. The willingness to use force that previous presidents would have hesitated to deploy is genuinely real. But here's the thing about strength without predictability. It is not reassurance, it is a threat. And tonight, every country in the world, ally and adversary alike, is recalculating its relationship with the United States based on that 4-day gap between diplomacy and war. This is the most consequential foreign policy moment of Trump's presidency. What happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether this is a limited strike that achieves its objectives and ends quickly, or the opening chapter of the most dangerous Middle East conflict in a generation. Nobody knows the answer yet. Not the Pentagon, not the CIA, not the government of Israel, and certainly not the government of Iran. What we do know is this: the world that existed when you woke up yesterday morning is not the world that exists right now. A war has started. The consequences are unfolding in real time. The gas prices are already moving. The markets are already reacting. The missiles are already in the air. And the man who started it told you 4 days ago that he preferred diplomacy. Watch the Strait of Hormuz. Watch your gas prices. Watch the casualty reports coming out of the region. Watch what China says. In the next 24 hours, watch the bond markets when they open, and watch whether the international order that Mark Carney spent 6 months trying to rebuild around a more predictable alternative to American power suddenly looks a whole lot more urgent to a whole lot more countries than it did yesterday morning. Because it might, and if it does, tonight is not just the night America went to war with Iran. It is the night the world finally decided it needed a plan that did not depend on whatever Donald Trump decides to do next. If you want to stay ahead of what is really happening behind the headlines, subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. This story is moving faster than any news cycle can keep up with. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think tonight's strikes will achieve their objective or whether we are watching the first move in a much longer and far more dangerous conflict. Because the next 72 hours are going to tell us everything, and you need to be here when they do.